My name is Einat Wilf, and I will discuss today the idea of Zionism denial. As if we don't have enough with Holocaust denial, I had to come up with something new to worry about. Right? Because we're in the business of coming up with new things to worry about. I coined this term a little less than a year ago in a piece that I wrote for the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel. And it reflected kind of a coming together of several thoughts that I had on things that were worrying me about the way that people perceived the legitimacy of Israel. Now, we're all talking about the battle against Israel's legitimacy, the illegitimacy issue. Certainly in the last couple of years, more and more people are aware of this issue, of the campaign that is taking place to undermine Israel's legitimacy. And this is one of the elements that is sometimes used in order to undermine Israel's legitimacy. And I would argue that Zionism denial in many ways is at the core or at the source of Holocaust denial. When we try to wonder why so many people engage in Holocaust denial, I would actually argue that the source of that, or the reason, is Zionism denial. Now, Holocaust denial is not something that people of goodwill engage in. You're not likely to find people who mistakenly engage in Holocaust denial or who have good intentions and somehow have done it without meaning to. But Zionism denial why this condemnation is truly unacceptable. The other reason is that there's almost this notion, sometimes among the more liberal leftists, that Israelis somehow revel in the Holocaust. In the sense that, and this is why I wrote the piece for Holocaust Remembrance Day, kind of, there they go again, telling us how much they suffered, and now we have to feel guilty, and now we have to feel that we owe them. And yeah, they must be so pleased that they have this kind of thing that is difficult to argue with. And again, if you think that Israel was established because of the Holocaust, indeed, we could actually think that Israelis revel in the Holocaust of, oh, yeah, something bad happened, but at least something good came out of it. But the truth is, if you learn the history of Zionism, the Holocaust was the greatest disaster for the state of Israel. Before it, Zionism was going to be an ongoing project of building the state. I'm sure you all know the stories of the young men and women in farms in Poland and Russia preparing themselves for immigrating to Israel. You know, all these bourgeois young people becoming farmers so that they can work the land in the kibbutzim in Israel. The Holocaust erased all of that. The kibbutzim movement that had many people in Europe preparing to immigrate, preparing to join the kibbutzim, lost all of them. So the state of Israel was in the process of building, and all of that was lost. So the thinking that something was gained by the Holocaust is a thought that we have to completely erase. And we need to remind the world of the geopolitics. Israel would have been established because the Jewish people willed it into creation. And it's critical that we remind the world that the Jewish people willed it into creation. They were not dumped there by guilty Europeans. They had a project. And at the same time, the British Empire was essentially falling apart. So just as no one thinks that India was some condolence gift or Pakistan was some condolence gift, Israel would have come into being because the British Empire was essentially falling apart. And the British, who initially, when they received the mandate for Palestine after World War I, it's very amusing to read some of the early writings, especially of Churchill. They thought this was a mandate for 300 years. You know, they thought the empire would last, and they assumed that helping the Jews reach sovereignty. Many people forget that this was the purpose So when we think about, many people think of Israelis as being very callous to the suffering of Palestinians, and don't they understand that we need to give them a state in order to end the suffering? But our DNA is that we have gone past our suffering. We have gone past our history to assume responsibility and to will a state into being, even if it meant getting much less than we thought we were owed. And when we're looking on the other side, this is the story that we want to see. This is the story that we could respect. And we don't see it. We don't see that process of willing a state into being against all odds, taking whatever is possible in order to at least have something. We see something very different. So once we bring that story back, I think we can also perhaps begin to explain why Israelis look at the conflict so differently than so many people that believe that they have some guilt to compensate for. Now, I will end just by saying that I have this kind of one little pet project, hope. Over the kind of the time that I was beginning to develop this idea of Zionism denial and why it's an insidious idea and why we have to fight it and why it sits at the core of a lot of the wrong stories that the world tells itself about Israel, about the conflict with the Palestinians, about who are the victims and what is Zionism. I really thought that one great way to do it, of course, would be to finally have an epic movie about the life of Herzl. Of course, my idea was that this would be the final touch on Steven Spielberg's trilogy on the Jewish people, and that he would make a story about an epic movie about his life. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read the book by Moshe Lon on Herzl. It's a remarkable book, and Herzl is a wonderful American hero, the kind of hero that American movies love, because he's the person who went against all odds, had a crazy idea that became a reality. He's the person that everyone said was insane, but he's actually the only one that truly got alternative history. And that's something else that I've been working on in my life, because the story from the Israeli perspective is one that Jewish life out of Israel is essentially non-legitimate. The story of Jews is always one of false heavens. Jews think they have it good, but just wait. That's kind of, which I always found a little ironic, because Jews existed for 800 years in Poland, but only a few decades in Israel. But yet, from the Israeli story was always one about that Jewish life outside of Israel is always temporary and always bound to end in great disaster. So that's a bit extreme on the other side, and I've been fighting that on how can we teach in Israel legitimate Jewish life outside. But basically, you will hear the story, the history will be going through this successive immigration. In fact, you talk about